Secret of happiness lies in knowing this, that we live by the law of expenditure. We find the greatest joy not in getting, but in expressing what we are. There are tides on the ocean of life, and what comes in depends upon what goes out. The currents flow inward only where there is an outlet. Nature does not give to those who will not spend. Her gifts are merely loaned to those who will not use them. Empty your lungs and breathe. Run, climb, work, and laugh. The more you give out, the more you shall receive. Be exhausted, and you shall be fed. We do not really live for honors or for pay. Our gladness is not in taking and holding, but in the doing, the striving, the building, the living. It is a higher joy to teach than to be taught. It is good to get justice, but better to do it. Fun to have things, but more fun to make them. The happy person is the one who lives the life of love, not for the honors it may bring, but for the life itself. Good afternoon. I am Reverend Dan Schatz. I'm minister of the Unitarian Congregation of Westchester, where David Rovner was a member. We have gathered in this virtual space to remember Dave, to mourn his death, to celebrate his life, and to say goodbye. Now, because this is an online service, it is different in some ways from the memorial services most of us are used to. I want to invite you, if you are so moved and if you happen to be logged in with a Google or Gmail or YouTube account, to write in the chat that runs alongside the video and let us know you're here and with us and remembering Dave. Also, if you are the sort of person who finds that chat distracting, you can simply hide it and watch the service. I also want to mention, simply because we had a little blip this morning, that we are at the mercy of multiple computer companies and also power companies. So if the video seems to freeze up for a moment, you might try refreshing your screen. And if something goes very haywire, then we will simply find a way to pick up at another time. We don't expect that to happen, but I just want to let everybody know in advance. We come to remember Dave. We come to remember him in his times of strength and in his times of weakness. To remember him in his moments of joy and his moments of sadness. To remember him as he was long ago and as he was only a few weeks past. To remember him as he was, not more and not less. We come also to celebrate his life and to share stories of that life, to honor his spirit and his dignity. We come to celebrate, and we come to mourn in the silent, empty spaces once filled with his presence. We come to mourn. And we come to say goodbye, because Dave's illness came quickly, and because it has come at a time when we're not able to be together in person as we would wish. Some of you might not have had the opportunity to affirm your love, or to resolve your differences, or simply to say goodbye. So we pause to offer these final words for him today. The flaming chalice is the symbol of Unitarian Universalism and is traditionally lit at the beginning of all of our services. Today, we light this chalice in Dave's memory. In our time of grief, we light a flame of sharing, the flame of ongoing life. In this time when we search for understanding and serenity in the face of loss, we light this sign of our quest for truth, meaning, and community. Dave grew up Jewish and studied Hebrew diligently through his bar mitzvah. And even after he became a Unitarian Universalist, his Jewish identity remained an important part of him. He was so pleased when the theologian Thandeka, who he met at a workshop, told him, "Your Jewishness will always be part of you." So in Dave's memory, his son Robert will say the Kaddish.
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm the youngest biological son of David, and I'm going to say the Kaddish. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabo, v'alma d'ibro cherusei, v'amlich malchusei, v'chayechon u'byomechon, u'chaya v'kol beis Yisrael, v'agala u'bisman koriv v'imru omen. Yeheshmei Rabba Mevorach, Le'olam Umayo, Umayo, Yisbarach, V'yistavach, V'yispoar, V'yisramom, V'yisnaseh, V'yishador, V'yisaleh, V'yisalal, Shemei Dikudsho, Berehu. Le'olam Min Kol Berchasa, V'cherasa, Tushvechosa, V'nechemosa, Yalmiran, V'yalmo, Imru Amen. Vehe Shloma Rava Min Shemaya V'chayim Tovim Ulenu V'yokol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Ose Shalom V'mora Hu Yaseh Shalom Ulenu V'yokol Yisrael V'imru Amen. And the English translation for that is, glorified and sanctified be God's great name throughout the world, which he has created according to his will. May he establish his kingdom in your lifetime and during your days and within the life of the entire house of Israel, speedily and soon. May his great name be blessed forever and to all eternity. Blessed and praised, glorified and exalted, extolled and honored, adored and lauded be the name of the Holy One. Blessed be he, beyond all the blessings and hymns, praises and consolations that are ever spoken in the world. May there be abundant peace from heaven and life for us and for all Israel. He who creates peace in his celestial heights, may he create peace for us and for all Israel. And say, Amen. And I'd just like to say that my father's memory will always be a blessing for me and my family, and hopefully for the people who are joining us today.
We have a reading from Herman Hesse. As every flower fades, and as all youth departs, so at every life stage, so every virtue, so our grasp of truth blooms in its day and may not last forever. Since life may summon us at every age, be ready, heart, for parting, new endeavor. Be ready bravely and without remorse to find new light that old ties cannot give. In all beginnings dwells a magic force for guiding us and helping us to live. Serenely, let us move to distant places and let no sentiments of home detain us. The cosmic spirit seeks not to restrain us, but lifts us stage by stage to wider spaces. If we accept a home of our own making, familiar habit makes for indolence. We must prepare for parting and leave-taking, or else remain the slave of permanence. Even the hour of our death may send us speeding on to fresh and newer spaces, and life may summon us to newer traces. So be it, heart. Bid farewell without end.
1, 2, 3, 4. I love your sense of humor. I love to see you smile. I love your sense of balance. I love your sense of time. I love your vision of the future and your hope that never dies. But it's your kindness that clears my skies. Yes, I love your wisdom, your knowledge of the past, your willingness to listen, your taste for what will last. I love your compassion for the suffering and your solid happiness, but it's your kindness that I love best.
David Richard Rovner never stopped growing. At 89 years, his mind was as open and curious as it was when he was 8 years old. And through all of those years, he grew in heart as much as he did in intellect. Almost all of the many great things that he did in his life came because he knew how to bring mind and heart together, and because he was never afraid to learn and to grow and to become more. Dave grew up in the 1930s in Philadelphia, where his parents owned a drugstore. He was the oldest of 4 kids and the only one of the siblings who was allowed to make sodas at the fountain, a privilege which pleased him no end. He was an unusually bright child. By the time he was 7, he had already begun helping keep the store's books. In elementary school, he would become so impatient with having to review material he had already learned that the drugstore workers knew to walk him back to school if he got too restless and walked out the classroom door. He skipped 2 grades in elementary school and started at Temple University when he was just 16 years old. After medical school at Temple, he moved to an internship in San Francisco and a period in San Antonio, Texas, in the Air Force, doing medical experiments. As an intern, he had loved surgery and internal medicine, but he settled on endocrinology and applied for a residency at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Dave said he had already experienced both coasts, so it made sense for him to try out the middle of the country. And besides, all of his internship friends said he'd never get the job, and I think that's what sealed it for him. He got in, the residency went well, and he stayed on, ultimately becoming a full professor. Dave and his wife Natalie settled in and began to raise their 3 boys, Art, Dan, and Robert. Now, Dave's family, when he was growing up, was not warm. We all know his emotional intelligence and sensitivity, but that was something he taught himself, and it grew over the years as he became a father. He could be stern at times, not unfair or quick to anger, and not controlling, but he had high expectations, and when they weren't met, he would become very quiet. If you were one of Dave's kids, you did not want him to become very quiet. That's when you knew you were in real trouble. And there were times in his earlier years as a parent when it was difficult for him to express how deeply he valued his kids. But Dave never stopped growing. And as they grew and he grew, he learned how to let his family know exactly how much he loved them. He built things with them, paid attention to them, made sure he was home for supper every night on time. And always he had that wonderful wry sense of humor, although he was also frequently accused of dad jokes. And when Natalie died, Dave became a single father of 3 kids, 12 and under, while balancing a career as a physician, researcher, and professor. I think that time and that period led Dave to do some thinking about his life. He loved what he did, but he had also become frustrated in his work at the University of Michigan. Dave wanted to be a teacher as well as a researcher. So when Michigan State University in Lansing opened a medical school with a focus on problem-based learning, Dave joined the faculty there. He began that work just about the time he married his second wife, Lisbeth. She had 2 boys of her own, Greg and Paul, and soon Jess was born, the baby girl in this huge blended family. Now, Dave's way of doing medicine brought together heart and mind. He was a scientist who always thought in terms of systems, and at home he could build anything. But he also knew how to listen, and he worked with patients and not just on them. That might mean developing exactly the right diet for someone who didn't want medication, or talking through options with patients at a time when most doctors just told people what they thought needed to happen. And in 1979, Dave became one of the founding members of the Society for Medical Decision Making, an organization dedicated to exactly that kind of approach. And meanwhile, the kids were growing older. They were beginning to go to college. Dave had taken up flying and flew his son Dan to college all the way from Michigan to Pasadena with his brother Robert along for that trip. As years went by and his marriage ended, Dave continued to grow as a teacher, as a father, and as a doctor. Now, Dave had first met Margaret through their decision-making research at Michigan State, and over time they began to spend more and more time together and fell in love. They married at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Greater Lansing, where they became members. Dave became a father to Margaret's daughters, Susan and Amy as well. All 8 children, whether by genetics or marriage, were both of their kids. Dave and Margaret were inseparable. From the early days when they would bike together around East Lansing to every trip, whether it was for work or for recreation. When they flew to India with Dave's medical partner, Vade, Susan came along and explored India with Margaret while the 2 physicians taught. And Dave continued to grow as a parent, husband, researcher, physician, and advocate. When he moved into retirement, he grew to become a grandparent, and that warm heart that he always had came to the surface more and more and more. Sometimes it was tempered with a dose of his wit, but always he was genuine and always vibrant. When he was 82 years old, Dave was hit by a bus and fractured 16 ribs among his other injuries. And at the hospital, when some of the residents found out he was a doctor, they asked about his medical practice. Dave mentioned his work as an author on a particular pivotal paper that identified what came to be known as Kahn syndrome, and what Margaret still insists ought to be called Kahn-Rovner syndrome. And the residents became very excited because they had just been studying and learning about Dave's work. And after that, they all suggested that Dave should help them treat their patients. I suspect he probably did, indirectly, teaching those young doctors how to be with patients through his way of being with them, as he had taught so many others. Dave never lost that warmth, and he never lost his intellectual curiosity. When he died, his stack of reading material included a copy of Nuts and Volts magazine, Science magazine, the Ultimate Compendium of Sensor Projects, the Astronomy Observer's Handbook for 2020, and an article from Scientific American about the speed at which the universe was expanding. At the same time, he helped run the Passover Seders at Kendall, loved coming to services at our congregation as we loved and love him. And he enjoyed his grandkids. He would answer anything from their list of Papa questions, or help them build something, or simply tell them what he admired about them. In the last week of his life, Dave joined as many family members as possible on a big Zoom call. He and Margaret sat together in their Kendall apartment as they all laughed and wept through memories and stories and genuine expressions of love. Toward the end of that conversation, as tears flowed more easily from everyone, they talked about how much it meant to them all to be able to talk together like that, and what a gift Dave had given them. Dave said, "It's at a deep, meaningful level, and that makes it both hard and easy, but in every event, meaningful." That encapsulates both Dave and his life. It was hard, with real struggles and loss, and it was easy, with deep love and compassion and wonder. But in every event, it was meaningful. For that, I know that he was grateful, as we are for him. One of the best ways to remember someone is to tell stories, and I know that we are going to be telling stories about Dave for a very long time. To begin today's storytelling, close friends of Dave and some members of his family have some memories to share, and we begin with Dave's dear colleague, Fade Gossain.
My name is Wade Gossain, and I had been David's partner for a long time. And now I'm a professor emeritus. After spending many years at the University of Michigan, David moved to MSU. When I first met him in 1974, he was the chief and also the entire section of endocrinology. He hired me. Or maybe I should say that he had the courage to hire me. Why do I say that? I say that because I heard rumors that at that time, in those early days of our department in college, there was some resistance towards hiring foreign medical graduates, which I am. He probably stood up, not for me, but for what he thought was fair and right. I joined him in 1975, and from then on until his retirement from seeing patients in 1996, we were essentially a two-man section of endocrinology at Michigan State University. He was my boss, who later became my mentor, and most importantly, a good friend. I distinctly recall a few months after I had joined MSU, we were at a meeting, and I introduced David. This is Dr. Rovner. He's my boss, and I work for him. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, no, wait. You don't work for me. You work with me. Believe me, those few words meant the world of difference to me. That's the kind of person he was. And although that didn't change how I interacted with him, it greatly increased the respect I had for him from the very beginning. It also taught me an important lesson that I learned from him, which I subsequently practiced, hopefully successfully, when I became the section chief after his retirement. David was an established investigator of international fame before he arrived at MSU. He was expert in the field of renin-angiotensin system. And as you heard, he did the early work of the syndrome that came to be known as Kahn syndrome. And maybe I have a slight improvement on Margaret's thinking. Maybe it should have been called Rovner-Kahn syndrome. This is one of the causes which cures hypertension. David was a giant in his field, and I, on the other hand, was a young endocrinologist just starting out. Whenever I wrote a paper or applied for a grant, I would ask him to look it over. And he was very generous with his time always. He would read the paper, provide constructive criticism, and I would then make appropriate revisions. And by virtue of the fact that we worked so close together, we were able to publish several articles, several scientific articles in many years. He deserves a great deal of credit, and I owe him a great deal of debt for the success of my own career. David was a teacher at heart. I think one of the reasons he might have left U of M is that he was so engrossed with the research that he did not have much time to teach. When he, or for that matter, when I arrived at MSU, most of the teaching was done by the problem-based learning format with very few lectures. He organized an endocrinology course for the second-year medical students, which we taught together along with the faculty from physiology. And that course was very well liked by students and continued for years. For residents, he organized a monthly teaching conference of endocrinology, which also continued for several years until it was finally absorbed into the weekly grand rounds. Not to forget the practicing physicians, he organized the annual diabetes update in 1975, which became an annual endocrinology update. I was fortunate to have participated in this symposium from the very beginning, and we kept it going until after his retirement. That has continued till today. And in 2017, it was named as the annual Dave Rovner Endocrinology Symposium in his honor. And I hope it will continue forever. Towards the latter part of his career, he became interested in medical decision-making. He enjoyed talking about how doctors make decisions and how they should be making decisions. He used to get upset when the residents would order unnecessary tests. He would tell them that the best test they have for any situation is their own clinical judgment. And would he go on to say, did you go to medical school for nothing? He would then explain how we determine the prior probability of a disease. And always somebody in the audience would say, but Dr. Rovner, that's just a guess. And Dave, in his usual calm manner, would say, yes, it is a guess, but it's a highly educated guess. David was a distinguished MSU faculty. He also served as the acting chairman of our department in 1976 and 77. In all the years that I have known him, he was always supportive of what appeared to be right to him, and he was always had the courage to stand up what he thought was not right or not fair. He was a gentleman. He was always willing to help anyone that needed or asked for it. In the 1990s, I asked him to accompany me to India, and we were going to conduct postgraduate courses in endocrinology in several cities of India. He graciously accepted my invitation and traveled to India at his own expense and delivered several lectures in different cities in India without accepting any honorarium. As I approach the end of my own career, I'm trying to write a story of my life. And the only reason I mention it is that even during the last few days of his life, he was helping me make it better. In summary, David was a gentleman, a great clinician, a researcher of international reputation, a wonderful teacher, and a valuable friend. I have no words to express my profound sadness that I feel at his passing. I know that I will miss him, but I also know that he would be missed by many more whose lives he touched. Rest in peace, my friend, and thank you.
Thank you, Vad. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this remembrance. My name is John Clarke. Although David's world and mine intersected in many places, such as the Philadelphia area where he grew up and went to school, and where I did as well, and the military, where we each served in the medical corps, and Ann Arbor, where we trained, admittedly half a generation apart. It was in 1979 at the inaugural meeting of the Society for Medical Decision Making that I first met David in person. David had gotten interested in applying decision science to medicine as a result of working with Arthur Elstein, a psychologist famous for his studies of the differences between novice and expert medical diagnosticians. David, of course, started as one of the experts that Arthur studied. But David's love of systems, his desire to understand how they worked, and his precocious interest in computers made the science of decision-making in medicine a natural area for his intellectual curiosity to explore in depth. David, Arthur, Margaret, who started as Arthur's research assistant, and Marilyn Rother, who subsequently became dean of the MSU College of Nursing, formed a significant center of research in this evolving field. David and I attended every meeting of the society but one from the first, which had about 40 attendees in 1979, and the second, when Margaret started attending in 1980, all the way until 2017, when the society had over 1,000 members, and David and Margaret retired to Kendall. I looked forward to seeing them every October and was overjoyed to learn they were retiring to Kendall, which was just 40 minutes from my home, where Miriam, my wife, and I could continue to see them on a regular basis. David always impressed me with his breadth of knowledge. The first home computers were not even being built by hobbyists until David was in his late 40s. But even with that late start, David seemed, to me, more knowledgeable about computers than I was. And just to put that in context, I was doing research in artificial intelligence as an adjunct professor of computer science at Penn. David served the Society for Medical Decision Making as he did MSU, with a willingness to do anything asked of him, without consideration of personal benefit. He and Margaret were honored with the Society's Distinguished Service Award in 1999. I think the most notable contribution to the field was a series of 10 articles on something called shared decision-making. The audacious idea that physicians should provide patients with information that would allow them to understand the medical choices that best matched their overall preferences for outcomes when each had a spectrum of advantages and disadvantages. As a trauma surgeon, I must also mention or reinforce that when David was 82 and hit by a bus in Washington, D.C., he really sustained a life-threatening injury with 16 of his 24 ribs busted. The fact that he survived despite pre-existing sarcoidosis of his lungs was probably more a function of his toughness than the death-defying medical care he received. Certainly, many patients have died from lesser injuries. In summary, the David Rovner I knew neither acted his age nor thought his age. He was driven by intellectual curiosity all his life and took joy in understanding, not just conjecturing on, what we did and why we did it. Although our relationship started professionally, it evolved into a personal friendship as I appreciated his enthusiastic curiosity about everything he observed. From the first time I met him in 1979 until our last dinner together in our garden this past summer. Thank you for the memories and for the opportunity to share them.
Hi, everybody. I just first wanted to thank Gossain and John Clarke for their really moving tributes to my dad. It gave me a lot more insight into his professional acumen than I ever even knew about before. So thank you so much for that. I'm Arthur, or otherwise known as Art Rovner. I'm David's son. The following testimonial that I will read to you was written by my uncle, J. Clement, who was married to my dad's beloved sister, Sandy, for many years. I am honored today to share Jay's thoughts with all of you. I met Sandy when Sandy and I became engaged in 1956. David was in the Air Force at the time, and I called him with the news and to introduce myself. He was immediately very welcoming, warm, and delighted. That was the beginning of a close friendship between the two of us, one that would last throughout our lives. As the years went on, we were separated geographically. David in Michigan and his sister and I living in New Jersey and later Philadelphia and then Boston. When David's first wife, Natalie, became sick, I drove overnight to Michigan with David's mother and Sandy to pick up his young children, Arthur and Danny, and brought them back to Philadelphia to live with us for several months. David was enormously grateful for our help, and we loved the children, and we're glad that we could step in at such a time. I can still remember taking them trick-or-treating when we came back to the Philadelphia area. Time went on, and David returned to New Jersey to pick up his children 4 months later. Sandy adored her older brother. She had great respect for his knowledge and understanding. They were always close throughout their growing up years, something that never changed throughout her lifetime. The distance geographically meant that we were mostly together over holidays. The contact was never lost between us, but was mostly conducted over the phone. David experienced a lot of loss over the years, but eventually met Margaret, a wonderful woman, and we rejoiced that he had finally found the right person to share his life with. When I think of David, I think of what struck me the first time I ever met him and never changed over the years. His enormous intelligence, his integrity, his solid sense of humanity. I always felt that David was more of a brother to me than a brother-in-law. It was impossible to know David and not have enormous respect for him. I am saddened at his loss and can honestly say that he touched my life and I will never forget him. Thank you, Uncle, for your stirring tribute to my dad. Next, I'd like to share my own thoughts about my dad. Today, as I look back on my dad's life, I marvel at the way he was able, time after time, to turn his difficult circumstances into growth. Through every tragedy in his life, he not only endured, but emerged with greater insight and compassion. I believe this is his legacy and his most important gift to us. Here, I will share with you the events of a chapter in my relationship with him, which to this day remains one of the most transformative lessons of my life. I was Dad's firstborn child and was lucky to inherit many of his attributes. During high school, I had good grades, was self-sufficient with a lot of friends, and to the outward appearances, I was a great kid. I really wanted my dad to pay attention to me. I wanted him to say, "I'm proud of you." But during that time in the early 70s, it seemed that Dad was preoccupied with the demands of his life and not interested in hearing about mine. In retrospect, I realized there were many good reasons for this. My mom had died suddenly when I was 12 years old, and my brothers Dan and Robert were 9 and 7, leaving Dad a single father of 3 young boys. After a relatively short term, he remarried, forming a blended family, including 2 stepbrothers and a new daughter, Jessica, my precious sister. There were a lot of demands, and life was at times quite stressful. I left home to go to college in 1975, and during those 4 years, there was little communication, and I felt distant and somewhat estranged from my dad. Fast forward to the late 1980s. I had finished graduate school and was recently married, ready to become a father myself. Dad had divorced and then married Margaret. There were now an additional 2 stepsisters added to the brood, Amy and Susan, for a total of 8 siblings. Dad and Margaret's children now spanned an age range of 20 years, and the interactions within our family were changing in significant positive ways. Margaret was bringing a new energy to the family dynamic. Dad was much more animated and happy now, and we were starting to form stronger bonds among family members. But I was still harboring a profound sense of loss in my relationship with Dad. There were occasional family visits, but I continued to feel wounded by what I perceived as his lack of interest in the details of my life. I also longed for him to directly express his feelings. I wanted to hear him tell me he loved me. Finally, in my early 30s, I confronted him about my wounds. I told him I needed time to talk, to complain, to tell him how hurt I was feeling, to get him to explain why he had seemed to me so absent and tuned out during my formative years. Dad did not avoid this or shrink away. He allowed me to pour out my feelings, to cry, to accuse, to ask why. And then, with incredible compassion, with an immense desire to make things right, without being defensive, he explained to me that he had done his best, that he had sometimes misunderstood my needs, that he had made mistakes. He made it clear to me that he was indeed very proud of me and that he loved me devoutly, and he apologized for not showing that more explicitly. Dad had grown up in an austere household with a demanding father, so his upbringing did not model open displays of emotion or affection. But at that moment, he pledged to me that he would do his best from that time forward to demonstrate his pride and love for me, so I had no doubt of their existence. And you know what? This formerly stoic man who had endured so much loss and pain changed himself, just as he had promised. From that time forward, he became more and more open, more demonstrative, more vulnerable, and more openly loving and supportive. The I love yous and the I'm proud of yous that I had craved for so many years were now available on a frequent and recurring basis. So, this is a story of redemption. It is the story of how a man who is filled with love, as well as his great intelligence, continued to grow and rise above substantial adversity throughout his life. It is a story of a father who cared so much about his children that he changed himself in profound ways, almost solely by sheer force of will. I love you, Dad. And I'm eternally grateful for the way you showed me your surpassing love. You'll always be here in my heart. Farewell, my sweet father. Thank you.
I'm Amy Holmes-Chavez, one of Dave's daughters. Everyone who met Dave immediately knew him as a scientist and as someone with an engineer's mind. Dave was logical, and it could make him absolutely bonkers when people were not logical. Dave had a deep respect for empirical facts. It bothered him in his bones when people ignored or misconstrued those facts. I think we all remember that look of indignation and exasperation on Dave's face in those moments. His expression said it all. How could this be? These are the rules of nature. Can't they understand? And yet Dave, particularly in the last third or so of his life, had a deep interest in and respect for the human condition. This scientist with an empirical mind often seemed in awe of that completely illogical thing we know of as our mind. All of his kids, his grandkids, his siblings by birth or marriage called David and Margaret for important consultation when we faced large decisions, roadblocks in our lives, or forks in the road. I was great for analysis paralysis. I could see so many sides of a coin and turn leaves over for hours on end, trying to get to just the right answer in an important personal decision. Dave would listen intently, provide thoughts here and there, ask questions, and then he'd become very silent while I dribbled on in hyperanalysis. Then there'd always be this moment of a pause, and Dave would say some form of, "Amy, what does your heart say?" Those are those out of yourself moments when you blurt out what your heart says, but your head has not been able to figure out. Dave would inevitably respond, "Then go for it." And I realized then that I had my answer. David and Margaret spent several Christmas Eve celebrations with us in Atlanta in gatherings of friends and neighbors at our house. Dave would often meet someone, chat with them on the sofa, and then after everyone had left, he had about 1 million insights and observations about the person, just from one brief conversation. He was truly fascinated by people. Dave was also a talented teacher of people at all levels, as we've heard today. My sister Susan loves to share a story of how one of Dave's grandsons has always made lists of scientific questions for Big Papa. When his list was long enough, he would call Dave and run through his battery of questions. Susan, also a teacher, reports that Dave somehow was able to explain really complicated scientific phenomena in terms that a 6-year-old could understand. Dave passed down his strong empirical bent to his children, who are doctors, scientists, and accountants. There's no denying Dave's affinity for logic, for setting up systems, and for understanding how things work. And yet, there's a yin and yang. That scientist mind coupled with this incredible intuitive talent for understanding and connecting with people ran the gamut of Dave's life. Dave could take all of us to an existential place where we were suddenly contemplating life, the universe, and everything, and I know you all remember that. With just one sigh, he would kind of touch his temple and get this quizzitive smile and say, "People are just so deep." Dave, we love you, and we miss you. Thank you.
Learning and teaching was a huge part of my dad's life. Case in point, one time while painting his basement, Dad insisted my lousy results were the result of too little paint on the roller, at which time I shot him the evil eye as he mimicked the constant paint skill criticism of my husband. In response, he replied, "I profess, that's what I do. What do you expect? I'm a professor." He taught me many skills over the course of my life: how to reconcile a checkbook, how to drive a stick-shift car, how to use the game of who can get their seatbelt clicked in the fastest to ensure a seatbelt is always used. He inadvertently developed many of the subconscious mantras I use for myself these days, one of which being nothing like experimenting with live data. As a child, I would ride shotgun to my dad while he flew a small propeller plane. Noticing one of the many instrumentation dials littering the dashboard, I asked, "What's that?" "The artificial horizon," he replied, expounding on its use as a tool to ensure the plane is flying level to the horizon. Noticing all the turbulence, I replied, "It's not working. We're bouncing around and the dow's not moving." "Yes, it is," he replied, and immediately put the plane into a blood-curdling nosedive. Well, a small decrease in altitude is probably more realistic, but to a 6-year-old who hates flying, it was a direct plummet to my death. The artificial horizon then logged a small decrease in altitude. Nothing like experimenting with live data. This was later repeated with a face-smushing side death roll whereby my eyeballs were plastered on the window watching the wing point directly to the ground, otherwise known as circling the airport, waiting for our turn to land, or some other equally innocuous term of flying. I suspect he also taught me to be systemic. At work, I am a super user of ERP software, oftentimes obsessed with understanding how the programming works, especially the data patterns and cause and effect. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? Clicking buttons all the way, to the point where even the IT guys tell me my obsession with the software is a little sick and wrong. Once you know the language, you know the system architecture, and you can build or understand anything from there. Once you know the language, you're no longer memorizing facts, you're speaking from knowledge. I suspect my dad taught me that. The man was tougher than nails. Everyone knows he was hit by a bus at age 82, but step back and think about that for a minute. At an age where many die from frailty, the man was struck by a multi-ton object traveling 35 miles an hour, was thrown 35 feet, broke 16 ribs, shattered his arm, lost part of a pinky, and survived with his mental facilities intact. I suspect from sheer will. The day he was hit, the Washington, D.C. papers reported a 50-year-old man was the latest WMATA bus victim. He laughed when I told him that in the ICU. Not good to laugh with broken ribs. The guys at work immediately dubbed him Timex. Takes a licking, but keeps on ticking. Even in the hospital, he lived by his learning, teaching the interns about Rovner syndrome as they were reading his paper at the time, refusing sedation as a healthy brain heals better, and professing at people when they didn't follow proper protocol. Probably less well known was the day we learned he was allergic to bee stings. With only himself and his 14-year-old daughter in the house, Dad had to drive himself to the MSU clinic for treatment with me in tow. The clinic staff were not checking him in fast enough. His demeanor was far too serene amidst his pending anaphylaxis. He let them know in no uncertain terms they needed to process him through faster. I'll never forget it. The dire warning of his calmly delivered severe words let me know the seriousness of his condition. Once he was treated, I was ushered into the treatment area with the staff giggling. He had tried to get up before the epinephrine kicked in and passed out. Funny things, how physically small things like bee venom and cancer can end a life when a bus could not. Maybe it's the internal versus the external. External forces are powerless. For all his challenging, prodding, and pushing back, there was never any question that he loved me.
Many fond memories of visiting them throughout the 90s, running around their backyard and playing in their tree grove, chasing away the rabbits that continued to attack Grandma Margaret's garden. He always had a smile on his face when we came to visit. His laugh was something you could not forget. Perhaps it was the benefit I had as a grandson, never having to witness truly anything negative, but only the positive from my grandfather. And those memories I will cherish for the rest of my life. I want to say Grandpa D was an intelligent man, but that's really understating it. I remember him building our family's first word processor before we had a home computer. I absolutely loved it. I spent a lot of time learning the customized DOS system that was installed on it, and learning how to navigate the commands that he built. And my parents were not as interested. So, whenever there was actual technical that we to, they luckily had a dedicated technical support team consisting of myself at 7-year-old, at 7, my grandfather, Grandpa D, solving any issues that might have arose. My favorite story, though, is the time he gave me 6th grade science project. I really needed something to help me boost my grade. And luckily, I took my mom's suggestion to call Grandpa D and ask for help. And he was more than happy to assist. I spent the weekend working with him, putting together the best science project of my life. After our brainstorming session, we decided that it would be a solar birdhouse. I learned a lot, starting with carpentry to soldering together a circuit board to connect to the birdhouse. And when I went into class that week to present, my teacher's jaw just hit the floor. I showed her by putting my finger over the panel, the light would light up at night for the birds. I don't know how important that really is for birds at night to use, but I received an A+, and I did receive a memory that I'll. Grandpa D was a reliable character who was always there to support and share what he knew with whoever was wise enough to listen. He impacted the lives of those around him and spent it learning. I love my Grandpa D, and I will miss him. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Margaret's brother, John. I first met David at Margaret and David's wedding. So you can imagine that. Your sister's marrying this guy. You have no idea what you're getting. Seems like a nice guy. Margaret says she loves him. It's a good start, but there's no way to know who he'll turn out to be. So years went by with visits and Thanksgiving together, and David and Margaret came to live here in Washington for years, so our relationship deepened. And David just kept growing on me. We talked politics, we talked computers, we talked about projects, and over time we came to talk a little more about our lives. And like Jay has already said, David gradually became more of a brother than a brother-in-law to me as well. He became family, and I came to love him, and he was a wonderful addition to our family. As I think about David now, what comes to me is a feeling of quiet encouragement. Nothing overt, like, yes, you should go try that. Just a deep sense of really caring about the twists and turns of my life and deep encouragement that it mattered. David was a brother. He was an unexpected gift, and he'll always live in my heart. Thank you.
Well, I said there were many stories about Dave, and I have a suspicion that we are going to continue to tell stories about Dave for a very, very long time. I know that we will, when we go from this service, that we will take some of his spirit with us, and that we will be sharing that with others for a long time. I would like to invite you into the sacred space, which is known by many names, beginning with a few moments of silent remembering. Dave, thank you. Thank you for more gifts than all of us could ever say. Thank you for your teaching. Thank you for your learning, for your gentleness, laughter, and warmth, for questions answered and questions asked, for love given and received, for organizing and advocating and healing. Thank you for the time and attention you gave to your children and grandchildren and the real joy that you found in one another. Thank you for days and evenings spent with friends and for always being open to new possibilities. Thank you for living life fully and joyfully wherever you were and teaching us to do the same. In this time when we are separated, we're helped by the openness that you taught. And as we reach out to care, reach out and care for one another, and especially to Margaret, who loves you more than any words could say. And also to Art and Dan and Robert, Jess and Greg and Paul and Amy and Susan, and to all of their children, every one of whom carries part of you in them. You live in every life you touched, and you touched so many. We will remember you and honor you every day of our living. So may it be. Amen.
May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. The rains fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of God's hand. Amen. Much love. God bless.
Although we extinguish this flame, the light that Dave brought to our lives remains with the warmth of our love and the fire of our living. These we carry in our hearts now and forever. And we close with words from Nancy Wood. Hold on to what is good, even if it is a handful of earth. Hold on to what you believe, even if it is a tree which stands by itself. Hold on to what you must do, even if it is a long way from here. Hold on to my hand, even when I have gone away from you. Thank you for being part of our celebration of Dave's life this afternoon. And may David's memory go with you and help to sustain you in all your comings and your goings. Rest in peace.